It's 9 o'clock in the morning at St Oswald's Parish Church in Coney Hill, a district on the outskirts of Gloucester. And local resident Tanya Dando is getting ready to feed people.
Right, so what they got in there this week, I haven't finished putting stuff in yet. They got toffee sundaes, peanut butter, gravy, carrots and a pie.
The Coney Hill Food Hub is one of thousands of community food providers to have sprung up in recent years. Here, every Thursday, without any questions asked, people can walk through its doors, spend time with Tanya and her team, have a cup of tea, sit down for lunch, and leave with a bag of food that could last a few days.
This is the calm before the storm.
Tanya, put the milkshake in the fridge.
Okay, my love.
Tanya opened the hub during the pandemic. Since that time, demand has kept on growing. More people, she says, are making tough decisions about which bills to pay and how much money is left over to spend on food.
I've done it myself in the past where I've had to choose my kids eating or me. So I'm like, no, the kids eat obviously. But now, if I can help somebody else take that decision away, they all can eat, that's what I do. I've lived on the breadline. I've lived from paycheck to paycheck. So I know what it's like, to juggle bills, food shopping, just normal expenses. I've been there, done that, I've got the T-shirt.
Whatever happens in the Middle East now, the impact of conflict on food prices is going to be felt across the world for months ahead. There has simply been too much disruption to the so-called 3 Fs that flow through the Strait of Hormuz: fuel, food and fertiliser. And in the UK, despite recent announcements from Rachel Reeves, including changes to tariffs on some food imports, among those likely to be most affected will be the people Tanya helps each week.
Most of our people in this community is in receipt of some benefits. We are classed as a poverty area. But the community, when the community needs to be a community, we all pull together. Yeah. And we all come together and we all help each other. I'd say by the time they've paid all their bills, all your important bills, your rent, your gas, your electric, TV licence, water, there's some people who works a full-time job who's left with no money for a food shop. None. And they go through banks and everything like that because they haven't got no money left. Because rent has shot up, council tax has shot up,
Energy,
and then
keeping
prices.
the car running.
Yeah, every aspect of life is gone up apart from your wages.
Is it getting worse?
Yes. Yeah. I'm seeing more and more people come through our doors now than what we did when it was back in COVID.
Yeah.
And as long as they're honest with me, I'll help you.
In this programme, we're going to be taking a deeper dive and a longer view into the causes, consequences and potential solutions to the expected increase in food prices. We'll be getting an insider's take on the tense discussions between Downing Street and the food industry, including the ones that led to a heated debate on price capping. And as this is a global problem, we'll find out what inflation means for other parts of the world, those in the global south, where there are existing concerns over hunger.
These countries have become highly dependent on food imports, highly dependent on imports of industrial inputs like fertilizers. Suddenly, when everything changes and prices go up, they're kind of left holding the bag.
You are ordered to go back to your departure immediately. You are ordered to go back to your departure immediately.
When the war involving the United States, Israel and Iran got underway in February, it was quickly followed by the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz, where traffic fell by around 95%. Ships, such as this one, once one of 140 or so vessels passing through, could no longer transport goods around the world.
Okay, copied your message. I will turn back.
We've all been on a steep learning curve about the strategic importance of the Strait when it comes to the global food system and the movement of fuel, food and fertiliser. So much has just been sitting there, trapped, along with crews on board ships.
We feel like, trapped inside the Persian Gulf and no further concrete information we are getting how to get out of there.
Order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting.
Last week, Parliament's Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee took evidence about what we'd learned so far about the impact of the war on the food industry, supermarkets and their customers.
We return this morning to our ongoing inquiry into food supply chain resilience and fairness.
And unfortunately, it's possible from other conflicts to know what we can expect when it comes to food price inflation.
When you ask what we learned, I think that we learned that energy is embedded in every single part of the food system, something that seems very live again now.
Among those giving evidence to the Select Committee was Karen Betts, CEO of the Food and Drink Federation.
The food system is competing in a very energy-hungry world now for energy. It was very obvious in the last crisis. I think it is going to be, increasingly obvious in the context of the current restrictions, the energy shortages.
In her evidence, Karen Betts made reference to previous shocks to the UK's food system, from Brexit and the pandemic, and on to the war in Ukraine. Food is now almost 40% more expensive than it was in 2021. As we experience yet another crisis, businesses are exhausted and there's little room for manoeuvre, Betts told MPs.
I think food manufacturers learned in that period. When we're talking to them now about the energy supply shock that we are going through at the moment, many of them are talking about how they have diversified their supply chains since Ukraine. I think lots of companies have looked very carefully at where their inputs are coming from, and where they can, they are relying on a diversity of sources. So I think in some ways the industry is more resilient on that front. Where they are less resilient is on cost, because I think that all of the efficiencies, all of the changes you could have made to bring down the cost of your product was made in the last inflation cycle. I don't think companies have got many places to go now.
Before we go into the details of why that is, let's cover some of the basics, including the nature of food price inflation itself. Over to the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack.
Put simply, inflation is the rate at which prices rise over time. And some things go up in price, some things go down in price. And the way we usually measure it is we have a basket of goods, things like airfares, food, professional services, getting a haircut, you name it. And they all go into a basket of goods. And you look at the price now compared to the price a year ago. Some will go up, some will go down. You take an average, and that gives you the general rate of inflation. Now, some things go up faster than others. And germane to this conversation is that food is going up faster than most other things. Bad news is that is predicted by most to go very sharply higher by the end of the year.
One of the forecasts predicting the highest increases, that of food price inflation of 10% by the end of the year, comes from the Food and Drink Federation. And their chief economist is Liliana Danila.
Our members, so food and drink manufacturers, tell us that they are already experiencing higher transportation costs by road by about 20%, but also higher maritime costs. Also, they are seeing logistical disruptions with cargoes having to be rerouted. That means that products arrive at destination with a 4 to 6 week delay. All of this will mean higher costs, and therefore we'll see them reflected in prices later on the year.
And there are other pressures driving prices upwards. Simon Jack.
People who work in food production or food preparation tend to be at the lower end of the income scale. And you see some quite hefty wage increases. National living wage, for example, went up 7% last year. It's gone up another 4% this year. For younger workers, it's gone up even more substantially than that. And you've got employers' national insurance, which have seen a big rise in those costs, which basically pushes up the wage bill. And some areas of food production are quite labour intensive. So you add all that together and you can perhaps see why food inflation is accelerating at a higher rate than elsewhere. So it's quite a sort of terrible cocktail of price rises, all filtering in to the price of food.
Which we'll be feeling well into next year, says Andrew Opie of the British Retail Consortium, the organisation representing the UK's biggest supermarkets. Again, it's the experience of other recent crises that shows us what kind of time lag we're expecting to see.
When you look at things like the impact of the Ukraine war, which also had a big impact on energy prices, it takes about 3 to 6 months before we start to see prices coming through the chain. Then you reach a peak of after about 9 months in fresh food inflation, and a little bit longer to come through in ambient processed foods, which would be about a year from the start of the Iran war, if it followed the same pattern as Ukraine, which we'd expect it to do. So by about March 2027, we should see the peak of food inflation.
Something that's amplified the impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz are changes that have taken place in the surrounding region during the last decade. Adam Henier is a professor in development studies at SOAS and the author of Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power and the Making of the World Market. As he sees it, China's economy boomed, its fuel imports from Gulf states increased, new levels of wealth were created there, and as a result, those Gulf states have gained greater influence over the food system.
This is the key shift that has taken place in the Gulf over the last decade or so, in that the Gulf is not simply a producer of crude oil or natural gas. It's become much more diversified industrially. And one thing that we can see is that it's become a major center of these chemical production. So, for example, the global ammonia trade, about a fifth of global ammonia comes from the Gulf region. About a third of urea comes from the Gulf states. So this is why the current war really has the potential to really have very deep ramifications all across food supply chains.
And that vertical integration, all of it is based in some way on fossil fuels, and that has wide-reaching implications way beyond fertilizers.
Yes, I was, for instance, recently in Thailand speaking about this issue, and in the audience was a rice exporter, a person who worked for a rice exporting company, and he made the point that Thailand is a critical part of the supply of rice across Southeast Asia. And he said, we're facing the energy shock. We're also facing the fertilizer shock. And then he said, the other factor, which isn't well understood, is we're facing a problem with the actual bags that are used to store and move the rice, because those bags are made from plastics, and those plastics tend also to come from the Gulf region. This is part of, again, of this vertical integration. So there's a manifold and multiple ways in which this crisis can kind of appear in unseen ways through the food system.
And another factor, Adam, I don't think has been talked about much, is the role the Gulf states play in the distribution of food.
Absolutely. The UAE, and in particular Dubai, and the Jebel Ali port in Dubai, is a major transshipment hub for food and other kinds of commodities. And again, this is part of the vertical integration that we can see in the Gulf states, alongside with their growing role in global trade and the movement of food and other commodities is their power in global logistics, ports and shipping routes. So about 60%, for instance, of China's exports to Europe and Africa pass through Dubai. This, I think, gives an indication of how central Dubai has become to global trade. So when ports like Jebel Ali are not able to function, it means that food and other commodities don't get where they need to go. And this really is a problem for countries in the region, as well as countries, for instance, like Sudan, parts of Africa and South Asia that depend upon those kind of logistics nodes as ways of delivering food and humanitarian supplies. So again, this is another example of these kind of unforeseen consequences of this complex global system.
Another factor, even less transparent, is what happens on financial markets. In previous crises, speculators have seen opportunities and moved in. Jennifer Clapp is a professor in global food security and sustainability at the University of Waterloo in Canada.
As food prices tend to rise, we tend to see higher financial investment in financial products like wheat futures. There's all kinds of exchange-traded funds and other kinds of commodity index funds. Investors go into those products as commodity prices rise. So as oil prices are rising, oil is part of some of these commodity index funds that bundle energy. They bundle things like fertilizer. They bundle things like food prices all into a single investment product. That's another way in which energy and food prices are coupled through financial investment. And we haven't yet seen the kind of speculation we saw after Russia invaded Ukraine. That was a more immediate speculative fervor. And we had that speculative fervor again, in 2008, partly because in those moments, the amount of grain in storage was a little bit less than it is now. So fortunately, we have a pretty good set of stocks in reserve right now of food, and that's keeping the lid on things. But if there's a major climate event, or once this, if this conflict lasts more months, it could balloon.
Commodity prices, including seed oils, meat, and to some extent grain, are increasing. But so far, it hasn't been as dramatic as during the start of the war in Ukraine. However, because of increasing energy costs and the concentration of fertilizer production Adam Hanier mentioned, volatility is on the rise. Over to Beth Bechtold, Deputy Director General of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. She spoke to me on a line from Rome.
Farmers are making decisions months before food reaches supermarket shelves. So today, given what's happening in the Gulf, farmers around the world, they are deciding what crops to plant. They are deciding whether they can even afford fertilizer. They are deciding how much fertilizer they should apply. And many are actually deciding whether they should postpone investments or different purchases. So the current situation, I would say, is maybe more of a warning light than maybe a full alarm bell. So the question today is, I think, not simply what food costs now. It's going to be about what food availability and food affordability look like in the next 6 to 12 months.
Beth Bechtold on the global picture. Here in the UK, the 40% increase in food prices since 2021 affects everyone, but not equally. Simon Jack.
The average household in the UK spends about 10% of their household income on food. Now, that is much lower than it was 50, 60 years ago. We've gotten used to sort of cheaper food. But even now, if you look at lower income households, they will spend 20 to 25% of their household income on food. So it becomes a particular problem for lower income households. And that obviously becomes a problem both economically, it becomes a problem politically. People feel that they are struggling to buy the basics. And if you put food together with energy, and those two things are linked, as we've discussed, if I'm spending more money on energy and those energy prices are feeding into spending more money on food, then you've got a double whammy, which is hitting incomes and fuels this idea that households aren't getting any better off. In fact, they're going backwards rather than forwards. And that is a very toxic sensation for households to have for politicians, incumbent politicians.
One of the organisations tracking food price inflation is the charity, the Food Foundation. Their chief executive is Anna Taylor.
I think what's really concerning about this coming period is that the Energy Climate Intelligence Unit published some data which basically showed that if the Food and Drink Federation's forecasts are correct, and we're at 9% inflation by the end of the year, we will have experienced, since mid-2022, a 50% increase in food prices over that period. So that's about 4 years and 5 months. What they looked at then is how long it took for prices to rise by 50% in the years preceding that, okay, to mid-2022. It took 19 years. So we've seen this just huge, compression of time over which we've seen this big escalation in prices. Wages haven't caught up, which is why it creates this huge pressure and flows through to people experiencing it really materially in terms of being able to put food on the table. But I think it also shows that people are coming into this crisis without any resilience. Their coping mechanisms have kind of been worn out. Savings have been worn down. The ability to be able to absorb yet another rise is much worse than it was when this first started back in 2022, because people have been worn down essentially and economically.
At the Coney Hill Food Hub, that's exactly how it looks to some of the people sitting down for lunch.
My name is Mrs. Rosina Yates of Coney Hill.
Why do you come?
Because the price of the food. Can't afford food. And I'm 65 this year. I had to change the way I eat, my diet. You just can't do it. You're frightened to put the lights on now because of the price of the electric and the gas. That's why people, like somebody like me that's on universal credit, people are frightened to cook with their gas or their electric. It's awful. That's why people like me living off sandwiches, because you can't afford to do it, because you're frightened. This is what you call survival. Survival. This is why I come up here on a Thursday to get like potatoes or whatever's been offered. To me, it's like Christmas Day to me.
Coming here?
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Reverend Rachel and I'm the vicar here at St Oswald's Church and obviously look after the church hall as well.
How long have you been here?
So just over a year. So, I know lots of people here will be on universal credit and other benefits, and so it's hard to make ends meet. So I'll go into some houses here and that will be my encounter.
That they are just talking about, I'm just getting by, I'm surviving.
Just surviving. Making ends meet, but not.
How do you see your role?
My role is to care for people, but also to offer hope. And part of what we're doing here at the Food Hub is to offer hope. So the way we do that, the practical way we do that, is to give people food with very low, minimum cost to them, but also we really feel it's important for people to be able to come in, be seen, be celebrated as who they are as human beings, whoever they are and whatever state they come into. So that's a real important value for us here in Coney Hill at St Oswald's. This is a bit of a lifeline for somebody like Rose, so she can come here, she can get a bag of groceries, which won't last her through the week, but will last for her for a few days. So it does take some of that pressure off. And also it's an opportunity for Rose to kind of sit down with people and to start offloading. And part of that is really, it's really important for us as human beings to be able to offload that stuff verbally.
Sometimes you can get a little bit depressed about it. So you sit back and think, is it worth it?
It feels that tough.
Yeah, it is that tough, yeah. No.
And a lot of that is to do with the economics of things, yeah?
Yes, it is, yes. On a Friday, I go down to another church and get another meal, cheap. I can't buy the things I want to buy. Just can't afford it, you can't do it. So you go without. And you wonder why, somebody like me is losing weight. Because can't afford it, can't do it. Yeah, survival. That's all I got to say, survival.
The likelihood of more of the UK's population sharing Rosina's experience of just surviving has also increased the intensity of the politics surrounding food price inflation. There have been growing tensions between government and the food industry, out of which came suggestions that could have been made in the early 1970s.
We plan to have a comprehensive control over prices, all the prices which we, as a country and as a government, can influence. Of course, there are some, particularly in the field of raw materials and fresh foodstuffs which we import, which are dealt with on world markets and which we alone cannot control.
Edward Heath in 1973 on the aims of the then newly established Price Commission. Today's discussions between the food industry and government about how to best tackle food prices bore echoes from that time, with talk of price caps. We heard about a regulatory approach in Scotland and a voluntary one in the rest of the UK, all of which led journalists at the 160-year-old Grocer magazine to dive into their archives and pull out editions from the early 1970s and see coverage of Heath's ambitions for price freezes. Grocer reporter Ian Quinn.
Whitehall even had a hotline that people could ring in to sort of dob in people who were not sticking to these price caps. And amazing, really, to think, even a few weeks ago, the prospect of Scotland suggesting price caps was pretty staggering. If anyone had said then that within a few weeks, the UK government would be proposing that, I think would have thought they'd lost the plot. But obviously, desperate times call for desperate measures.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has the right economic plan.
What emerged instead when Rachel Reeves made an official announcement last week was a change to the UK's tariff regime on a selection of food imports.
Today I am taking action by suspending tariffs on over 100 different foods sold in supermarkets. And I am clear that I expect supermarkets to pass these savings on in full to their customers.
Reeves's statement riled parts of the industry with its references to price gouging and retailers being put on notice. Ian Quinn of The Grocer.
It sort of has left a bit of a bad feeling because supermarkets already have a bit of a bad rep with the public. A lot of people have an impression that supermarkets are ripping them off, making millions of profits while everyone suffers from the cost of living crisis. And there are legitimate arguments about some of the profits that supermarkets make and some of the big salaries, etc., etc. But we have had 2 CMA inquiries on this which have found that isn't true and that the UK market is extremely competitive.
The CMA is the independent watchdog, the Competition and Markets Authority.
It's making it sound as if supermarkets are being kicked, dragging, screaming into this process rather than wanting to help keep prices down. It's giving the impression that the government is doing everything, and I think it's just adding to that tension, really.
This is just the beginning. The politics of food price inflation is expected to become more intense and more complicated. For example, earlier this year, the government revived plans for a new nutrient profiling model. This will determine what counts as a healthy and less healthy food, and in turn influence the ability to advertise and promote different products. Because of the cost of living crisis and, the industry says, the prospect of higher food prices to come, plans for a new model should be put on hold. It's a distraction, says Andrew Opie of the BRC.
So a nutrient profile model would be a good example where actually we are not against the changes per se. The problem is the model as it's been designed at the moment simply is unworkable. So we are saying to government, use the time to actually find a solution so we can use the new model. And at that time, that then allows us to focus on keeping food prices down.
Meanwhile, the Food and Drink Federation are also calling for the plan to be put on hold. A new nutrient profiling model will require another wave of product reformulation, it says, involving expensive efforts to reduce levels of sugar and salt. The food industry is wrong on this one, says Anna Taylor of the charity, the Food Foundation.
The goal here has to be affordable, healthy food, right? Where healthy food is the most affordable option for people, and so people are not priced out of good health. And all the work that all of these different policy measures, one of which is the updated nutrient profile model, are gradually moving us in that direction where the incentives in the system are oriented towards that. That's universally what the citizens want when you ask them. They just want it to be easy to eat well and affordable to eat well. And so it's pretty disappointing that companies are using food price inflation as a reason not to act on this. I obviously hope that the government will hold its nerve. There's no reason to think why sort of measuring the amount of sugar in a product, which is essentially what this kind of conversation boils down to, should flow through to food prices. This is about us transparently knowing what is in products which are on sale for everybody.
Back at the Coney Hill Food Hub, food quality is also on the mind of its founder, Tanya Dando.
Somebody a couple of months ago said, I feel guilty because I can afford to feed my child chicken nuggets. But you're feeding them. And why is all the healthy stuff so expensive? It should be even cheaper if it's healthier for the kids instead of processed food. But if that's what you feed your kids because that's all you can afford, your kids fed.
You've mentioned about chicken nuggets.
Yeah.
Do people find the processed food cheaper, easier to buy?
Well, if you look like 4 chicken breasts, fresh chicken breasts, it's £5.95. A bag of chicken nuggets is £2. There's a big difference, so you do what you do to feed your kids.
Anna Taylor of the Food Foundation.
We know that overall unhealthy calories are half the price of healthy calories, and that gap is widening. That's something else that we track. If you're really pressed, you're basically going towards the things which fill the family up. I've heard families talk about the fruit bowl becomes out of reach for the kids now because we don't want them eating it all at once and then it's going and there's no fruit left. It's kind of rationed. All kinds of ways in which families have to take steps to make sure that they can still put a meal on the table, and that often means compromising on health.
So Anna, with forecasts of higher food prices, what do you want to see?
Top of the list has to be putting some high level of protection in for those most at risk. So by that we mean the youngest children in the poorest households. Those are the children that are, if they don't get support at the right time, it's too late. They're laying down the foundations for their future health when they're young. So we have a scheme called Healthy Start, which provides vouchers for very low income families with children under the age of 4 to buy fruit and veg, milk and a few other basic nutritious foods. At the moment, the value of that voucher is £4.65 a week. It's not aligned with inflation and needs to be higher. We also think it should be extended to 4-year-olds. Because at the moment 4-year-olds are excluded, so there's a kind of gap between children when they start school and become eligible for free school meals. We'd also like to see the eligibility extended. You have to be extremely poor to qualify, and we think it makes sense to say, well, for all families that are dependent on universal credit, let's make sure that their kids qualify.
Meanwhile, on the food industry's wish list, along with its calls for a rethink on regulations, are demands for a change in the way it's viewed as an energy user. Some businesses, such as chemical companies, are already recognised as energy-intensive industries. For them to remain competitive, they receive targeted benefits and are exempt from a levy for so-called non-commodity costs, such as the renewables obligation. The food industry should be treated the same way, says Andrew Opie of the BRC.
The government does offer direct intervention already for very energy-intensive users, so like steelworks, glass makers, those sorts of people. It could offer exactly the same for large food factories, for example, to help them with their bills. But more generally, every business pays this levy for non-commodity costs. The government could suspend that for a period, and I guarantee you that would result in lower prices in our supermarkets.
When we put all of these points to the Treasury, they told us,
"We know people are paying more because of the war in the Middle East. This is not our war, and that is why we did not join it. The priority is de-escalation and supporting families and businesses through this crisis. We're acting to protect people from unfair food price rises if they occur, to bring them down, and have made targeted cuts to food tariffs products, including biscuits, chocolate, dried fruit and nuts, to help to reduce pressure on food prices."
Let's zoom out again from the UK's experience of food price inflation and think more globally. Around the world, because of the war in the Middle East, along with other conflicts, President Trump's changes to trade rules and climate change, even more severe inflationary pressures are being felt. Professor Jennifer Clapp, who we heard from earlier, has spent years looking at the deeper, less obvious systems and structures that contribute to higher prices. In her latest book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture, How a Few Giant Corporations Came to Dominate the Farm Sector, she looks at the big four inputs into our food: machinery, seeds, pesticides, and part of the story we've already touched on, fertilizers.
Although globally the top four firms control maybe a quarter of the global fertilizer market on the global scale, if you look at the national level, it's often much, 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 much more concentrated. So in North America, it's like two companies control almost 100% of the potash, because potash is so geographically bound. And in in nitrogen, I think it's 75% of the nitrogen market in North America is controlled by just four firms. And it's the same. If you go to Indonesia, it's 99% of fertilizer market. Nitrogen is controlled by four firms. So it's concentrated in specific locations.
This type of concentration of power in agricultural inputs can impact prices, argues Professor Clapp, particularly during periods of crisis and chaos in the food system, such as at the start of the war in Ukraine.
At that time, we saw grain markets go crazy because Russia and Ukraine collectively supply a huge proportion of the global export market, but also fertilizers coming from Russia and Belarus were disrupted. Indeed, supply chain disruptions were leading to higher prices, but prices went up so sharply and so quickly, and also beyond what you would think would normally happen. And it turns out that the corporations were even, some of them, bragging to their own shareholders in their annual reports that they were able to increase prices that they were charging to farmers beyond their own price increases. And if you look carefully at the profit data, you see that not only were the overall net profits of the firms rising quite sharply through that period, but their marginal rate of profit was also rising. So they were able to increase the rate and increase their overall profits by a huge amount. And this led to widespread concern among farmers that they were basically being way overcharged for their fertilizer. And they were actively complaining about this. And this did reach the level, especially in the U.S., we saw that under the Biden administration, there was an effort to look closely at these complaints by farmers. So that they were able to get that on the radar.
So what, if anything, can be done? Well, prompted by the arrival of the Trump administration and changes to global trade, the impact of conflicts and climate change, Professor Clapp and other renowned experts in food systems published a report last month, The New Geopolitics of Food. It highlights how many countries' food systems have become increasingly vulnerable, dependent on distant markets, fragile supply chains, and a handful of powerful exporters and corporations. This mostly affects low-income food consumers and import-dependent countries. The conclusion of the report, which is published by the global think tank, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES Food, says a priority should be efforts to reduce volatility.
We're basically calling for what we call resilient self-reliance. We're basically saying that the disposal of all the policies that allowed states to take a role in smoothing markets, in managing markets for food security, that was taken away, and states need to reclaim those kind of policies, but to do so in a way that's resilient, fair, and just. We're not just saying, states need to get back into the business of managing markets just for the sake of it. We're saying, no, it needs to be done in the context of, not dispersing all trade, but to trade in ways that is mutually beneficial and with norms of fair trade, but also to do so in ways that support ecological agricultural production. It's not just saying, states need to get back into supporting agriculture through industrial models. No, we need to be more agroecological. We need to support biodiversity. We need to, reduce reliance on fossil fuels. But we're saying that there is a productive role for the state in managing these markets in ways that can ensure people have access to sufficient food.
There are similarities here with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos earlier this year. The neoliberal era is over, he said, and states caught out in that process need to hang together. Jennifer Clapp agrees. States of a similar size with shared interests can cooperate more, help each other to rethink farming and innovation, and increase cooperation on trade. This isn't about being isolationist, but more self-reliant.
There's benefit in these states cooperating with each other, sharing information about how to grow food ecologically rather than just relying on big tech, big data, big digital agriculture and that sort of thing. That's going to lead to more fossil-intensive agriculture, and we need to move away from that.
Hi. Right, so what we're doing is sorting out the bags, finishing spring onion pasta.
That analysis is big picture and long term. At the Coney Hill Food Hub, meanwhile, Tanya Dando has her sights on feeding her community and what's expected to unfold in the coming months. We're being told by people in the food industry that towards the end of the year, it could get very bad when it comes to food price inflation.
Yeah.
Does that worry you?
Yes. It worries me not just for myself and my family, but for my community. You know what I mean? Because most of our community is young families with children, and they're going to struggle. So we need to step up our game here again, so we're prepared for when the time comes.
Tanya Dando at the Coney Hill Food Hub. Some of what they provide comes from the food waste charity FareShare, a former winner of a BBC Food and Farming Award, in their case, the Innovation category. Nominations are open for this year's awards and close 12 midday 15th of June. Go to bbc.co.uk/food awards, where you can also find the full terms and privacy notice.